So just this morning came in over the transom in my email a plug for this book from Amazon called First-Rate Madness: Understanding the Line Between Leadership and Mental Illness. Now it's not a surprise that I got this. It's hardly one of those mystic coincidences that weird stuff never happened. That would be weird, right? Those of us who know something about math and the law of large numbers. But this, it's interesting because I'm going to be talking about skepticism and politics and what those who believe in objective reality, what your politics ought to look like, and so forth. So I thought this was interesting. I've also brought a copy of Mike Shermer's The Believing Brain, which came out not too long ago, which I will enthusiastically evangelize for here as well. Okay, so this is my talk. And here's some quotes. But I want to thank my colleague for mentioning about the article in the New York Times and how George Bush knew that his actions are wrong. From that same article in the New York Times Magazine by Ron Susskind was this idea here, this quote: "When we act, we create our own reality." And by we, he meant those on the inner circle who are political actors who have who are surrounded by who surround the centers of power and who spend a lot of time in Washington. The aid is believed to be Colorado. But here's some other things as well. And so I picked these because they connect politics and belief, and that's an area of obvious interest. So these are some of the questions that I'm going to explore in our time together. The connection between skepticism and politics. What do I think the appropriate politics for a skeptic are? And how should skeptics discharge their political responsibilities? Or do you even have it? Anarchists may argue that you don't have a discussion about that. This is my personal background. This is my attempt to argue from authority, or at least from a position of some credibility. I'll put this up here only to suggest when I gore your particular ox, that you may find something up there that you will like, and I can perhaps argue that my street cred, for example, with liberals in terms of First Amendment issues and willingness to engage the religious right is pretty good. On the other hand, I have an interest in free markets and limited government and things like that as well. I did write an article of this same title in the Skeptical Inquirer magazine in May of '97. It's interesting to see how things have progressed since then. The last bullet may surprise you as well. I value Jewish community, I value Jewish culture. Obviously, I think the Bible and the Old Testament in particular are a myth. I think that doesn't make them unimportant or uninteresting, and I'm much more of a believer in affiliating with organizations and trying to influence them from within than I am in ideological purity and saying, no, I'll have nothing to do with you. And otherwise, I wouldn't be at the Air Force Academy, right? So let me state my personal biases up front. This is my perspective. This is how I describe myself. I'm reasonably comfortable with the label. I would also argue that as a libertarian, libertarians are disproportionately represented in the skeptical movement. When Nick Gillespie asks, who's the editor of Reason magazine, was on a panel at the Amazing Meeting a few years ago, he asked how many people in the audience would consider themselves libertarians. About a third raised their hands, which is way more than the general population. And of course, we have our usual celebrity connections as well. All these people up here are out as libertarians. So this time I'm arguing not from authority, but from coolness. I will, however, so I'll let you know my personal prejudices and perspectives up front, and I will try to ensure that my ox is gored at least a little bit. So the main point that I'm going to make, if you do nothing else, if you come away from nothing else, is that I believe that skeptics ought to be skeptical about government and politics in terms of its effectiveness and usefulness too, in addition to being skeptical about everything else. And I don't think that uniquely dictates your political perspective, although I've made some personal decisions in my life as to how to best achieve those kinds of goals. But basically, I would encourage people, whatever your political stripe, to examine government and politics as a whole, and not merely point to the successes of particular social programs that you like, the ones that you think work, and say, well, yeah, see, there's that. I don't think that's an appropriate perspective for skeptics to take, and I will try to explain why. I believe that politics is much more about belief than evidence. That's a descriptive statement. It's not a normative one. All of us here would probably like it very much to be about evidence. We would like to believe that politicians debate evidence and make their decisions based on the evidence, et cetera, et cetera. But candidates want you to believe in them. They want to get people to believe something. Politics is very much, as practiced, and not just in America, but everywhere, is much more about belief than evidence. It's a mass movement. It's primarily emotional. Look at any party convention, right? Any gathering. There's a reason why it's called Gathering of the Party Faithful, right? Pick your party. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I believe that myth is very prominent in politics in the sense of a deep historical narrative that is rooted in human nature that we aspire to, that resonates deeply within us. And that doesn't mean that it's bad or trivial or stupid. It's just important. There's all sorts of them. The outsider candidate riding in on his white horse who's going to clean up Washington. The man of the people, Fritz Hollywood loves to make movies about myths because they know that people want to watch them. They want to see them. They'll pay money to. It reinforces some very deep stories and issues in human nature. I think our preference for charismatic, powerful leaders is evolutionarily selected for. There's reasons for that. Now, again, so much of the things that we are evolutionarily selected for were adapted for a world thousands or millions of years ago when such things made sense. They're now it's lousily adapted, it's contra-adapted for the modern world, but we're sort of stuck with them and we have to deal with them as we can. So these are some of the things that I ask you to think of what government is for. If you were to ask most reasonable, thoughtful, decent, right-thinking people what government is for, these are some of the things that they would answer. So I think these are things that most people believe most of these things. I think most people, though, or at least a decent proportion of them, who are at least thoughtful, also believe these things. This is sort of the warm, fuzzy idea of what people like to think government is for and sort of what it's all about. Now, I would argue that these are either contradictory or impossible. In theory or practice or both. Now, people routinely want contradictory and impossible things. That's kind of our nature. The problem with politics is that it is based on convincing people that they can actually have them, right? That you can actually have contradictory and impossible things, right? You can have things without paying for them. You can, here's the benefits of something, and I'm going to spread the costs out over millions of people who will never notice it, that they'll be thinly distributed, so it's as if you get it for free. And that's, among other things, how you get votes, right? How you get people to believe that they can have things without paying for them, that they can have things without cost, so that the cost will be borne by the other guy, and the other guy's bad, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is a fundamental disregard of economic reality. I think that markets and non-political action, by contrast, doesn't abide by contradictions. A company that routinely spends more than it takes in is going to go broke, right? You can't, there's a certain sort of fundamental, I don't want to say it's sort of an ultimate reality, but there's a certain unwillingness of markets and voluntary transactions, voluntary non-political action. There's a certain intolerance of that for a contradiction. There's a certain unwillingness to put up with stuff like that. And those of you on the left who think that all action is political, well, we could talk about that offline. So what should skeptics think of social conservatives? Here I think I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak. I don't think this is what people are going to argue with any of these things. How could we believe that his victory in the Iowa caucuses was due to a few elections ago that was the only explanation that was possible? Okay, well, no, that's not true. I don't think someone who thinks that is qualified for public office, and that's the only explanation that he can think of. I don't think that's right. I don't want someone like that in the highest office to be the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. I don't think that's right. I don't think skeptics would either. Rick Perry believes that politicians should keep their faith close at hand. Again, I don't think that's right. And I don't think, if people want to challenge me on this, we can talk about it. But I think in this room, I'm not going to get much disagreement. Mitt Romney believes that the angel Moroni dictated to Joseph Smith after he looked in a hat and put in the seer stones the certain new scriptures, and that the Indians or a lost tribe of Israel and stuff that are just plain weird. Right? It's just, and it's and the evidence says it's not true. So I find those things troubling. So I think skeptics ought to be legitimately worried about such people wielding political power. I don't think I'm going to get much of an argument about that here. Yes?
Got to play skeptic's advocate. Is there any evidence that Mitt Romney, for example, has used that in his position as governor. Has he ever looked at
No, not to my knowledge.
I'm sorry. How is believing the Joseph Smith thing any more weird than believing that the creator of the universe raped a woman, had a son, brought that son to earth, killed the son, had the son resurrected to absorb all the sins of humanity?
No argument.
No way any more weird than that.
No argument, except that I would argue that those things happened many, many years ago. So far in the past that we don't have direct, the burden of proof is on them to show that that's true, and I think that they can. But Mormonism was started 150, 200 years ago, and there's enormous historical credible evidence that their claims are false. In my opinion. Okay. Again, social conservatives and social engineering. These are some of the things that social conservatives like to do, that they believe in. I would argue, anyway, that the evidence suggests that these things are not particularly effective. That but regardless of the evidence, and again, we can at least have an evidence-based discussion on these things. But regardless of this, my attempts to engage with social conservatives on these issues are that they think it is important to make a statement, right? To send a message. That the purpose of law is to send a message. Right? So that's a faith-based argument, one that I think is not an appropriate perspective for a skeptic to have. Some would argue this is about establishing the kingdom of God. And again, I don't think. So anyway, for conservative social engineering, I think this is a skeptical response that I think is perhaps appropriate. Now, however, let me say one other thing. Neoconservatives have believed, and I think largely faith-based, and disregarded the evidence that we can reshape the world in a pro-Western, pro-democratic, perhaps pro-Christian fashion. I think this through military power. I think this claim is faith-based in the sense that it's immune to evidence, and I'll put up the wonderful book, The Icarus Syndrome, by Peter Weimar, who's very solidly left of center, and talks about over and over again about American hubris and why we tend to succumb to it, despite the evidence. We believe Woodrow Wilson was the reason to govern the world before World War I happened. We had Vietnam, we were going to defeat communism and grow democracy there. Iraq and Afghanistan, again, that was all, we were going to, they were all going to welcome democracy, and it's going to be a great thing. So I think skeptics should be skeptical on foreign policy issues, not in terms of our ability to defeat an adversary militarily. I think the evidence says we can do that. But I would also argue that the evidence suggests that in terms of building nations and ushering democracy, that's much harder. Now, one might argue, yeah, but the alternative is worse, and we can have an evidence-based discussion about that. But at least it needs to be an evidence-based discussion. Okay, so now this is the part where I will probably lose half to two-thirds of the audience and maybe more, where I argue that I would suggest that the welfare state and democratic social engineering is just as problematic as the social engineering of the conservatives. And these are some of the things that I would argue. Whatever you think about the welfare state, it has grown far, far beyond what it was originally intended to do. And it has legions of unintended consequences that nobody expected and nobody agrees that everybody agrees are bad, but nobody seems to be willing to do anything about it because it still resonates deeply, or because you're just a Democrat because the Republicans are stupid and the Democrats are obviously better, so that's what I'm going to do. So again, we can talk about, we can have an evidence-based discussion about this as well. I just want to throw out what I think are the similarities. Some would argue on the left that corporations run everything, that that our elected leaders are just officials for a shadow corporate government, that they help business to screw the poor and screw the workers. My only response to this would be, you might ask yourself, is corporate control, whatever you think that is, stronger or weaker with the rise of government and the expansion of government? And if so, whose fault is that? Right? It seems to me that government that is strong enough to redistribute wealth from group A to group B is just as strong to be influenced by corporate interests. It seems to me if you have a big pile of crap in the middle of your house, and you don't call and then you've got flies, right? The flies aren't the problem, right? The big pile of crap in the middle of your living room is the problem, right? If you collect a bunch of cheese from a bunch of people and put it all in Washington, and then the mice all come to Washington, you don't have a mouse problem. You're collecting too much cheese, right? They're just doing it they're acting in their own self-interest like everybody else. So I think it is delusional, in my opinion, to hope for, one, a government strong enough to implement social justice, but not but to be without the other, without corporate influence and corporate control and the whole evil corporate American thing. I think it is inconsistent and delusional, in my opinion, to aspire to both, to have one but not the other. No government anywhere has done that, and so I think it's an inappropriate position for skeptics to take. I engage pragmatic, what I call pragmatic liberals on a fairly regular basis. They think government should do whatever works. Right? But if it works, we should do it, and if it doesn't work, then we shouldn't do it. And that's, of course, arguing, how can I be against that, right? That's like arguing against motherhood. But government programs always have unintended consequences. They may be worth the benefits, they may be really teeny, but you never talk about them. It's not part of the political discussion, even among the pundit classes. You don't talk about unintended consequences of legislation. You don't talk about how the environment that you're currently looking at and operating in is influenced by regulations that were passed 50 years ago and are long since been out of date, but it doesn't matter because you can't repeal regulations. They're the law. Pragmatic liberals, in my opinion, are easily seduced by favoring concentrated benefits over distributed costs. They look at and see the things that are easily seen and don't see the things that are less easily seen. That's the job of the economist, right, is to see what is not easily seen. So there isn't, for another example, government should only help the deserving poor, but it shouldn't help people who can work for themselves and who take care of themselves. Well, sure, in some sense, a sort of warm, fuzzy sense, but in actuality, I would suggest there's no government program anywhere that works like that. There's no government, rather, that supports only those programs that work or that helps only the deserving poor. Right? In practice, we get, all governments everywhere, we get all this stuff. Right? It all comes as sort of one package deal. Now, maybe that's okay, maybe you think it's worth it, and of course, that's entirely up to you as your decision. But again, I think to believe that politics could ever actually work in such a fashion, it is hopelessly delusional. To believe that politics could actually, we could keep the programs that work and throw out the ones that we don't, that there's some sort of scalpel that we could use to, cut like that. It doesn't work. Government is a baseball bat. It's a nuke. Right? It is not a scalpel, in my opinion. Politicians are also, as another example of sort of delusional reality and attempts to manipulate belief, politicians love to redefine words. They think that they can do that or at least use them very, it's a language game, right, as my colleague would argue. Here's just one example of how this is done. If you look at the debt ceiling deal, and I wrote a column about this as well, the myth, the narrative is that Democrats were agreeing to unprecedented cuts, Republicans were driven by crazed Tea Party fanatics, were irrationally unwilling to compromise and refuse to budge on any tax increase. And so they were crazy, and this was sort of how the whole chattering class sort of bought into it. What actually happens is politicians, particularly in Washington, they believe that they can create reality. And so they can define what words mean. And if they want to change, if they want to use a word differently from how the rest of us use it, that's okay, because they're politicians. In particular, they decided that cut was going to mean something different. And this is actually supports stuff on the left, belief on the left, who believe the language creates reality, as opposed to or reflects our perfect perception of it. So it turns out in Washington, the word cut actually means a reduction in fixed increases that are just assumed to happen. That is, if you assume that some baseline for the CBO or whatever is currently in the law, if spending targets for agencies are set to go up by, say, 10% a year, and the Democrats in their magnanimity will say, okay, let's have it be only 8% a year. That's a 2% cut. That's how they use the term, right? Or maybe it's actually 20%, right? Because 2 is a fifth of 10. Right? That's a 20% cut. Okay, so I have met no one anywhere, I've never read any literature anywhere that disputes this use of the term, this political use of the term. But at the very least, tell us that's what you're doing. Okay? Tell us that's what you're doing. Don't deceive us and pretend you're doing something else. But it's politics. You can make it. Words can mean whatever you want to mean. So, for example, and this is as an objective sort of database source. These numbers come from the congressional office. If we actually had real cuts, that is, when you spent less, cut in the sense that you and I use the word. If we actually had real cuts of 5% a year in federal spending, and taxes went up and revenues went up by 5% a year, true increases and true cuts in the same way, then the budget would be balanced by about 2016. Right? That's objective, factual data. But you can, to actually have a real cut in a 5% per year, oh, that's insane, right? That's nuts, right? Impossible. So that's just an example of skepticism and data and politics, and something that I think is of interest. So some of this talks about economics. It's legitimate to ask, so what is, economics is, of course, varies all over the map. Which branch is closest to reality? Well, again, this is somewhat controversial. I'll throw out my opinion. Hopefully it's informed. And we can talk about it over lunch or something like that. I don't believe that classical Keynesian economics is particularly related to reality. There's this idea of aggregate demand, and there's a mathematical notion of equilibrium, that those are all nice things that economists can all agree on when they talk about, but in terms of actually relating to reality, they have, as one of my colleagues in the economics department at the academy says, no more reality than Homer's gods. I think that's right. And particularly Keynesian economics, which is supposed to spend more to stimulate the economy during recession and run surpluses at other times, I think that completely ignores how politicians behave in practice. Again, it's a disregard of reality. And it doesn't mean that we have bad politicians. That's just kind of how things work. So here's another myth that the Republicans are the party of smaller government. You might ask, so what does the data actually show? This is real spending increases under various presidential administrations. So, full disclosure up front, this data comes from the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank. On the other hand, the data are all taken from the CBO. If you take a look, so maybe we're manipulating the data in some way. But you want to check, well, for example, what about the role of Congress? Well, Bush, in particular, for 6 years of his terms, had the Republicans had control of the House and the Senate. So the point being that, actually look at Clinton. Clinton actually did much better. If by better you mean lowering the rate of federal spending. So again, it's a myth that people like to perpetuate. So the economic discipline that I think is closest to reality, I think, are the ones that are up here. There's something called public choice theory, which says that politicians basically act self-interested as an individual, just like everybody else. They do things that respond to incentives, they do things that will get them elected, they concentrate benefits, they diffuse costs, they don't act in the public interest. And I'm sure we're all shocked to hear that. So what are the consequences of that? There's the Chicago School, which is extremely empirical. The Monitor School and the Economists at the University of Chicago are very much interested in looking at what data actually show. To my mind, the Austrian school really has that the economy is an essentially complex system. It's far too complex to be quantified analytically. You need to think about human action and human choice, and under what circumstances those things operate best. So here are some libertarian myths. I'll try, as I said, I would try to gore my own ox, something that markets are perfect. Smaller government will get us to this utopian, wonderful society in which prejudice, poverty, hunger, and bad things will disappear. Some of them are kind of hung up on the gold standard. I'm not wild about it, but I think fiat money, all things considered, isn't the worst thing. We actually believe people truly want freedom and responsibility for their own lives. That may not be true. As someone who spent a lot of time in the Ukraine, for example, in Eastern Europe and Russia, that may very well not be true. And maybe we think corporations are too benevolent. That's so responsible. But I would argue laws and politics are imperfect too. There are unintended consequences. Sometimes we must choose between imperfect alternatives. Just because things suck doesn't mean that something coming out of Washington is likely to reduce the suckiness. Right? Sometimes we have to choose between imperfect alternatives. So all of you know about market failure, or at least anyone who studied high school economics. How many of you know what political failure is? Have you even heard of that? No. Hal has. Right? Hal does, because he's a smart guy. But political failure is when politics doesn't reach an optimal decision. And that happens, guess what? All the time, right? All the time. So at the very least, if you're going to judge, you shouldn't judge markets by their failures and government programs by their successes, right? And that's not an appropriate position for a skeptic to take, regardless of what your politics are. Yeah. Okay, so I have to wrap this up, and I'm giving another talk at the end of the day. Maybe we can continue. Maybe continue there. There are reasons why skeptics and people in general will never agree on a single political perspective, and that's because all of us, I think, form our opinions on two dimensions. For some things, the role of evidence is important and our personal values don't matter. For other things, our personal values matter a great deal, and the evidence doesn't really matter too much. So it doesn't matter to me if you could show that throwing a random virgin into a volcano would leave millions of people better off. I wouldn't care. It doesn't matter how strong the evidence is. I don't care about that. I would still argue that it was wrong. There are other things where it's really the evidence that's important to you, the data and the world values doesn't matter. I try to spend most of my time in the upper right-hand corner, where things that I feel like my personal values and the data really support me most strongly. So are all politics equally divorced from reality? I think not. I'd like to think, down here, I think local politics is pretty reality-based, right? You don't get, local politicians can't earn money, they may say stupid stuff, but it's not delusional. So that's my current theory anyway. I have to cut things off, for which I apologize. So here's the conclusion. So I think if you're a consistent skeptic, you should recognize that politics, by its very nature, is much more about belief than evidence. That's inherent in it. So and I think it always will be so, always. So I would argue that it means that politics is not particularly effective for accomplishing most social goals. That instead, we need to think, it argues for it has certain limited functions that we can do, that we can use it for because there's no other way to do them. But that it also argues for a much smaller government than what we have today. And you can work through that as a Democrat or as a Republican or as a Libertarian. How much smaller and how to get there? Boy, that's a really good question. And I don't claim to know the answer to that. I have an idea of the direction that I want things to go. Right now, I just want to get the discussion going because it ain't happening. At the moment, if you argue for smaller government, you're a crazy Tea Party fanatic. Right? You're a nut job. You're obviously a right-wing crazy. You're obviously a right-wing kook. You're obviously prejudiced. You obviously want to screw the poor. You obviously think it's okay for people to starve. So on that note, I'll have to stop. I don't know if we have time for questions, or maybe I should wait till lunch.
Yeah, lunch probably would be best.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I didn't have time to make the talk shorter, but I will absolutely be available for questions. I'm talking at 4:30. Maybe we can stick around. I know Hal in the back is dying to decapitate
Can I leave it at 3? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
My only question was going to be, wasn't your talk, we say this is dear friends for 20 years, wasn't your talk actually just a libertarian rant? I think divorce in reality.